But I mean, the thing. So from when I last spoke, because I'd love to talk to you about the kind of global transition in the automotive industry, because it is obviously it's big, it's happening, and it's very disruptive. I think it would be a fair description.
Since the last time we talked, so much has changed and so much hasn't. What hasn't changed is that electric cars continue to grow quickly around the world. What has changed is the winners and losers are changing dramatically, and it will change the landscape of not only our industry, but the industrial manufacturing footprint around the globe. And that is very disruptive. We always thought the most disruptive part of our transformation would be going to advanced electric architectures and software-enabled cars. And although that is really transforming the industry, 70% of all electric cars made on the globe are made in one country, China.
Yeah. Wow. It is 70%. I didn't realize
70%.
That. Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
And then that market is starting to specialize, where they have electric vehicles for long-range travel, where the charging structure is not built out, called an EREV. It goes 150 to 200 miles, all electric. It's an electric car, and it has a small industrial combustion engine that powers the batteries, and that could power on one tank of gas up to 1,000 to 1,200 kilometers.
Right.
But it drives as an electric car. There's no transmission, there's no axles or differentials. It's a pure electric vehicle with a backup system in case you can't find charging.
Yeah.
And in China, it's the fastest growing subsegment of the EV industry. Right. And now you have the geopolitics and the labor and everything connected to these second order issues with electric taking off and having the Chinese be so dominant around the globe in terms of cost. And they see Europe and the UK and many markets around the globe as opportunistic. And that is totally changing the global supply chain footprint. Yeah. It's changing brand preferences. It's changing jobs. Yeah. It's going to transform our industry. And in the last year, that's come into focus.
Right. Yes, I think so. I think everyone's aware of that. I mean, I just wanted to say that when I last was in Australia early this year, my sister-in-law and my niece, who are two people who you couldn't find anyone with less interest in cars, except they drive them, because they use them. They both got BYDs.
There you go.
And that was not, and you'd sort of think, oh, well, that's because they've talked to you, Robert. I never mentioned anything about it because there's no point talking to them about cars. They're not interested. Yeah. So I keep, and they are so common there already. I mean, that explosion of their uptake is extraordinary in Australia.
And it's included in the combustion world. I think the best-selling SUV in Australia, which is a very important market, as you mentioned, because it's completely open.
Yeah.
And yet people drive like Western Europe or even in the U.S. in places. So it's a very important market. I watch it very closely.
Yeah.
Maybe more than Norway these days. And also the best-selling SUV there is no longer Toyota or Ford. It's Haval, and it's a Chinese brand.
Yeah.
So things are changing. Mexico, 25% of all sales in Mexico, which it'd be a long drive, but I could get there in one day from where we're doing this interview. And that's 1 out of 4 vehicles sold in Mexico is built in China.
It's built in China. And these are not all electric, but a lot of them will be.
No, you're right. Half are not.
Right.
But, it just happens in our industry. It happened with the Model T. When a new technology comes, there's a fitness test for costs. And whoever has the lowest cost, like Henry Ford with the Model T, they tend to have the opportunity to sell into higher cost markets like Europe or Britain or Mexico or Australia. And that cost advantage is very material for the customer. It could be 25% savings.
Yeah.
And in the world of tough choices, where your car is the second most expensive thing you buy, a lot of customers I'm willing to take a risk. And, Chinese manufacturing has really been proven to so many consumers and so many consumer product categories as being fully, superior quality in many cases, in many categories. So it's not like the risk that some people would imagine even 5 years ago. So it's for being the head of Ford, this is the topic that we discussed the most in the last year. How do we compete? Where do we want to compete? How do we win? What rights do we have to win? What capabilities do we have to build in the company to compete and survive?
Yeah. And I mean, in a way, because I've sometimes referred to previous, expansions of automotive manufacturing around the world from different countries. So like Japan, Korea, other Asian countries that made a big impact on the American market. I'm talking particularly about America. Toyota in the kind of early 1960s was a tiny company that made not particularly attractive cars. Well, they became massively successful. But what I feel is what's happening in China and the Chinese car manufacturing is kind of an order of magnitude different, because Japan is essentially quite a small country.
It is. You're absolutely right. Let's look at the numbers. The global new automotive market is 90 million units.
Right. So that's what's manufactured each year is around 90 million.
Yes,
right?
90 million. And Japan is between 4 and 5 million. So that's not even 5% of the global.
Yeah.
You add Korea in there, it's even smaller market. China is 1/3. It's 30 million vehicles. It's twice the size of Europe and the UK combined.
Wow.
And they have 58 million units of capacity built out already. So they can export 28 or 29 million vehicles. And that is larger than all of Europe, all the UK, and most of Mexico, part of the US, and all the companies wouldn't have to build one vehicle. And they don't have to build any more factories. That's the factories they have today.
Right. That is huge, isn't it? Yeah. That is extraordinary. And I mean, what I think is, because you will have been aware of that for 20 years of that happening. But I think the general public have gone, where do all these Chinese cars come from? And then and I always go on, well, look, your phone, the router in your house, the cabling, the little clips they're all made in China, as is your hat, your trousers, your shirt. Everything it's like that.
Well, I think people maybe not realize this, but I hope they do. China made this commitment more than a decade ago.
Yeah.
Far before any of the Western countries fell in love with pure electrification.
Yeah.
And companies like BYD, they were very small when they started their journey. They're now much bigger than Tesla, the biggest in the world, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And they've been on this journey for 15 years. CATL, the biggest battery company in the world that makes batteries for your iPhone and most of the devices you mentioned, they're the largest battery company in the world. They were founded more than two decades ago. And Robin, who found that, he's the largest battery maker. We're starting to make his batteries here in Michigan, and we'll be the first one with LFP chemistry in the U.S. But they have IP that the rest of the world has not developed. It's not the old days where someone would copy a Western technology. The opposite is true. Yeah. When it comes to battery tech and the size of the market and the government's support for the companies, and the enduring investment for 10 years plus to be a leader in the IP like battery tech and the whole raw material of batteries, plus all the processing of the raw materials that happens in the country, that is a dominant move that happened a decade ago, and now everyone's seeing it on the street in front of their house. But it didn't happen overnight. The market was big enough for the last 6 or 7 years where none of those companies needed to export.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't big enough. And then everyone started to notice. But for a company like Ford, this is something we have been watching for a while, but I've had 2 trips to China in the last 2 years that were literally epiphanies, where I walked away. The last one was about the Xiaomi product, because in the West, our cell phone companies are not into they don't have car companies. Yeah. But in China, both Huawei and Xiaomi, the 2 biggest cell phone companies, are inside of every vehicle that is made. In fact, Xiaomi, the Apple, you could argue the Apple of China, they actually make their own car, the whole car, and now it's one of the best-selling cars in China.
Yeah. No, it is. When you think of the sort of amount of our media attention and discussion and hypothesizing about the Apple car, which
this
we never
is twice as big. The market is more than twice as big in total, and the electric part of the China market compared to the U.S. or Western Europe is like 20 times bigger. So you're exactly what you said. It's like everyone's talking about the Apple car, but the Xiaomi car.
Which now exists and is on the road.
Which now exists.
Tens of thousands.
And it's fantastic. They sell 10,000, 20,000 a month. They're sold out for 6 months.
Wow.
You know, that is an industry juggernaut and a consumer brand that is much stronger than car companies. I don't like talking about the competition so much, but I drive the Xiaomi. We flew one from Shanghai to Chicago, and I've been driving it for 6 months now, and I don't want to give it up.
Right. Wow. That's extraordinary thing to say, isn't it?
Yes.
I totally understand it. I mean, I think it's great that you do, in that sense that you're experiencing what, you're not saying, because I do remember seeing a load of BYD cars at the Geneva Motor Show, and I think about 2009, and I thought, these are not good. They're not well made. They looked weird. They just didn't look right. But my goodness, now you look at what they're doing. Anyway, we don't have to talk about